Hi, I'm Starborn. Tonight we're going to be doing a different kind of show. What I'm going to be talking about tonight is the strengths and the weaknesses among the sun signs, all of your sun signs. And what we're going to discuss is a basic characteristic of how we begin to look at a chart. And then we'll talk about your lights, the sun, moon, and ascendant, and the rulers of your signs. And then I'm going to go into the strengths and the weaknesses of each sun sign and what they represent by the sign and by the house. And so it's very important to realize that when we are looking at a chart, what we're trying to do is we're trying to find the weight of the planets and the signs. We're trying to see what is stronger and what is weaker so that we can understand the whole person. And so when we are looking at a chart, it's a circle, and a circle has 360 degrees in it. And so theoretically, since there are 12 signs and 12 houses, each one should have 30 degrees. So what we're going to be looking at is a full picture of a person, and what we're going to be looking at is general characteristics. And the way that we figure out what those are is doing it the way the ancient wise men did it. They did start with a circle, but the wise men were living in the Middle East, and the Middle East is where the sun rises in the east, and so they called the left-hand side of the chart the Eastern Hemisphere, and that Eastern Hemisphere has the ascendant in it, which is the point that the sun was rising and coming over the horizon at the time that a person is born. So that's why we always need the date, time, and place that a person is born in order to calculate that correctly. The other side of the chart, the right-hand side of the chart, is where there can be a number of planets, but that is the furthest away from the ascendant. So the ancient wise men divided the chart, and they said that the left-hand side of the chart is, as I said, closest to the ascendant. And so if you were going to look at the number of planets that were in that Eastern Hemisphere, or that left-hand side of the chart, you would count those up, and if you had the majority of planets in that sector of your chart, it would indicate that you are a very independent person, because those planets would be closest to your own special star or your ascendant. If, on the other hand, the majority of planets were on the right-hand side of the chart, the dependent side of the chart, it means that you are a person who likes to work in partnership with others. You sort of like to stick to the group, or you like to be a good follower and a good teammate. And so the person who has the majority of planets on the independent side of the chart, that Eastern Hemisphere, is always going to think for themselves and be very independent, and they are not as group oriented, and sooner or later, if they don't like what the group is doing, they're going to leave and go on their own. Whereas if the majority of your planets are on the right-hand side of the chart, you are never going to abandon the group. And you would feel terrible if someone abandoned you, because you really are very partnership oriented and dependent upon others. It doesn't mean you can't get upset by what people are doing, but it's not your nature to leave them high and dry either. The ancients divided the chart in another way. Remember that horizon line where the sun is coming up right over the horizon, and that determines your ascendant? They divided the circle, the chart, to have a top half and a bottom half. If the majority of your planets are in the top half of your chart, it means you're very career oriented, that you will sacrifice some matters that have to do with your home and family life in order to be in the public eye, or in order to do whatever is necessary for your career. If, on the other hand, the majority of your planets are on the bottom part of your chart, below the horizon line, it means that your private life is very, very important to you, and you are never going to sacrifice that for any kind of career opportunity. It doesn't mean you wouldn't work. It simply means that you're working to provide for those at home in a way that guarantees their safety and security, or you could be working for good retirement, for having a better life later on in life. So those are basic characteristics that you can get just by counting the number of planets in their broad locations, which is good. Another way we can weight the chart in order to see general things about a person is to look at where the lights are. You have the sun, the moon, and your ascendant, and those are the three lights in a chart. If the sun and the moon are trining each other, what that means is that they're both in the same element. You could have an Aries sun and a Leo moon, or since that's a fire element, or you could have a Taurus sun and a Virgo moon. That's in the earth element. But as long as the sun and the moon are both in the same element and they trine each other, it is an indication that you basically do trust yourself, which is good. If the sun and the moon are squaring or opposing each other in a chart, it means that you can be undecided at times, and particularly if the sun and the moon are opposing each other, it means that you are extremely uncertain and you can be sort of worried about outcomes and therefore never quite reach your full potential because you can't quite understand completely what you're all about. If the sun is trining the ascendant in your chart, it means you have good insight to yourself, that you really do understand yourself pretty well. But if the sun or the moon is squaring or opposing the ascendant, it means that you don't understand yourself very well, that you really can't understand why you do some things because there's sort of a disconnect and there's no clear insight at all. Another way that you can be looking to and try to understand yourself in a broad way is to look at what the rulers of your sun sign are doing. And that is because, let's take the example of something that's happening in the heavens right now. If you were a Scorpio, this would be a good time for you because your rulers are Mars and Pluto. And currently Mars is in Virgo and Pluto is in Capricorn. Those are earth signs, but they're the same element. So the rulers of Scorpio are trining each other, and that is very harmonious, and that would tend to support the sign. That would give it a better and stronger weight to the sign of Scorpio itself. However, if your ruler, let's say that you're an Aries, and your ruler is Mars, and let's say that Mars is in Libra, and your sun is in Aries, that means that your sun is square the ruler of your sun sign. And that simply means that you would have challenges in your life. And that is because you really wouldn't get your own way because your own ruler is somewhat debilitated. It's not in a harmonious aspect to your sun. And that means life would be a little bit of an uphill battle. There are some people that really welcome challenges, and hopefully that would be a person that wouldn't mind a lot of challenges because their ruler was actually in harsh aspect to their own sun, so they would be facing challenges their whole life long. That's the way it goes. All right, there is another thing that we can be looking at as well, and that is that we want to be looking at where a planet is by the sign and by the house. And why is that so important? Well, the reason why it's equally important to understand the strength or the weakness of a sign of a planet by the sign they're in or by the house they're in is because in a traditional chart, which the ancient wise men did set up, there is, they figured out what the strengths were in every single house, and they assigned that certain traits to a constellation or a sun sign. And that never changes. And so, for instance, once again, if you were an Aries and your sun was in your first house, which is what Aries traditionally rules, you would be a real go-getter. But if your Mars was in Libra, like the example that I just used, it would be opposing your sun sign. And that means that your ruler, Mars, would be in conflict with your sun sign. It would actually be in the 7th house, Libra, and since you would have Mars there, it means that your partnerships could be very stressful. It would be hard, there would even be abuse from some sort of a partner because Mars can be an abusive planet and it's in a bad position to your sun sign. It's opposing it. And so Where the planet is by house and where it is by sign are equally important. And that is why when we're weighing the chart, when we're weighing the strengths and weaknesses of each sign, we need to take a look at what sign a planet is in, and also, equally important, what house it is in, and then what the aspects are between the planets and between all the other planets. Okay, let me explain some of the strengths and weaknesses of all 12 of the sun signs. What do they mean? Well, Aries, for you, since your sign does rule that first house of self, it simply means that if a person has their sun in the first house or they are an Aries, it simply means that they are go-getters, they are very impulsive, they are very enthusiastic at the beginning of something, and they're excellent at new starts. But the weakness in that is that they can also be a little bit inconsiderate of others. In other words, they are so focused on getting ahead when Aries is strong in the chart, or when Mars is strong in the chart, or when there is a planet in that first house, which Aries traditionally rules. They can be so focused on their own aims and needs that they are not at all in touch with other people's needs. And that means that they can get a little bit ahead of themselves sometimes, and that is a weakness because then they're losing support. Or it can simply be that they can be risk takers, take a lot of risks, and that can be costly at times as well, so that can be a weakness. What does it mean for a Taurus? Well, Taurus, it simply means that if your sun is in your second house, which Taurus does traditionally rule, it can mean that you're really a good money maker and that you can be very benevolent and want to provide for others, which is what your sign is very good at. But if your sun sign is anywhere else in the chart, let's say it's in the 8th house and not the 2nd house, it would mean that you'd have a little bit of trouble with that, or there are times when you might lose a job or you'd be out of work, and that is because the 8th house opposes the 2nd house. And if your sun was in a house that opposes the traditional position of Taurus, it would weaken your sun sign. And when the sign of Taurus is weak, or there is a weak or a harsh aspect to your sun sign, it simply means that you could be very stubborn. You could refuse to listen to other people and want to only do things your own way, and therefore you may make a few enemies. It also means that you would doggedly stick to a point of view. Even if things had changed around you, you would not want to change with them, and that could hold you back as well. So that's a little bit of a weakness. Okay, what does it mean to a Gemini? Gemini, your sign traditionally rules the 3rd house of everyday life and early childhood education and easy conversation and being pals with people. So that's what you're good at. You know a little bit about a lot of things, and you are very adaptable and flexible. And so that's wonderful. If your sun is in the 3rd house, or Mercury, your ruler, is in the 3rd house, that would certainly be for the good in your chart. But if your sun or your Mercury was in an angle that was harsh to your sun sign, or for instance, if your sun was in the 9th house instead of the 3rd house, it would be opposing the house it traditionally rules, and it simply means that you are a person that would find it very hard to settle down to any one thing. And a Gemini doesn't like to settle down too much. They like versatility and change. And any time when you are put into a position of conflict where you are held down or you can't change, that can really bring out the worst in you. So that is a weakness. So if your Mercury, say, is square Mars, it means somebody could be trying to force you to think one way or another, and that wouldn't be what you want to do, Gemini. Yours is a light, airy sign. It doesn't like to get too serious and tied down. And so the idea of sort of being a rolling stone, it would sort of appeal to you, and that is why your sign rules journalists who do travel quite a bit. But they go into a story and they get the story and then they leave the story, so there is always change. Any aspect in your chart that would indicate a harsh aspect to your sun or to your Mercury, your ruler, or if your sun was in any house other than the third house, that would tend to limit you. And that is why some of your ambitions would never be met. It also means that you could be very gossipy and you could talk behind people's back, and that would be a weakness that would make you unpopular. Okay, what does it mean to a Cancer? Well, Cancer, your sign rules the traditional fourth house of home and last half of life. And that is simply an indication, since your sign rules endings, that the first half of your life, and particularly your early childhood, could either be a sad one or in some way it would limit you. And maybe you wouldn't be able to have your dreams achieved when you were younger, and that is what could be sad. Or you could have had to take on extra duties when you were younger, and that could have limited your fun, which is too bad because kids like to have a lot of fun. But because, so a Cancer generally does not come into their own until the last half of their life, and because your sign rules endings, you are very good at putting an ending together, and you're very thoughtful and considerate, so that any ending that you have, let's just say you have to move somewhere, it's done with everyone's blessing, which is wonderful. But if your sun was in some house other than the fourth house, or if your moon, the ruler of your sign, was in square to your sun, wherever your sun was, it could make you indecisive and uncertain, and it could tend to bring out the worst in you. And what is worse, or a weakness for a Cancer, is moodiness. In other words, Cancers have very sensitive feelings, but it can be that you would become very, very moody, and that is when you would withdraw, and that's when people cannot figure out what's wrong with you. Maybe you couldn't even figure out what's wrong with you, and that could be very perplexing. So that is where a weakness could come in. What does it mean to a Leo? Well, Leo, this is, since your sign is ruled by the sun, it's very important for you to be sunny and optimistic and good-humored and very creative, because your sign does rule the fifth house of entrepreneurship and creativity and children. So you're a person that really likes a good time and a good party. But if there is a harsh aspect to your sun sign, or if your sun is not in that fifth house, it's somewhere else, then it's not in the house that it rules, and therefore it would be a little bit weaker. And if your sun and moon opposed each other, or there was a harsh aspect from the malefic planets, Saturn, Mars, or Uranus, to your sun sign, that would bring out a weakness in you. And that would make your sun less effective. And a weakness could be that you could be too controlling, that you would really want to have everything your own way. After all, your sign is the sign of the king or the queen. And that could set people off and make them resent you. And so that is why you'd have to be a little bit careful about that kind of a weakness. Okay, what does it mean to a Virgo? Well, Virgo, your sign rules the traditional sixth house of service to others, and particularly in capacities where you are not the leader, you're not the star, but you are certainly the power behind the star, because your sign would rule the assistant manager or the teacher or the nurse who's taking orders from the doctor. And so your sign rules being very, very supportive, and because the number 9 is associated with your sign, it means that you're a good finisher. But you're also quite a worrier, since your sign is ruled by Mercury, the planet of the mind. And if Mercury was in harsh aspect to your sun, or if your sun was in any other house except the sixth one, it simply means that you may be unhappy sometimes being of service to others, because you could get used by them, and you wouldn't really want that, because you wouldn't be appreciated for that at all. And you could be nervous and high-strung if there were malefic planets, either Saturn, which could create depression, or Mars, which can create anxiety. If those planets were in harsh aspect to your sun, that could weaken it as well. Okay, what does it mean to a Libra? Well, Libra, your sign rules the traditional seventh house of partnership, which you really like to be in, and yours is a very peace-loving sign. But as I mentioned, if it is in any other house except the seventh one, you're not so partnership-oriented. You could have other interests outside of partnership. And if, for instance, Mars was in your sun sign, or Saturn was there, it could really limit your ability to be in a partnership, and that would make you very, very sad and disgruntled. And when a Libra is not happy, then their creativity stops and they stop being supportive. In other words, they simply withdraw, a little bit like a Cancer does. And they stick so exclusively to their own point of view that they just create a sort of a barrier between themselves and others, which is the exact opposite of what you really like, which is partnership instead. So that can be a little weakness. Okay, what does it mean to a Scorpio? Well, Scorpio, your sign rules the traditional 8th house of death and regeneration and psychological transformation and change brought about by deep truth, which is what one of your rulers, Pluto, rules. And so you can be very much, you're a good money manager because yours is a fixed financial sign, but it rules other people's money. And that's why you're good at managing other people's money or other resources. And it would be for the betterment of others. Your sign also rules justice and it rules survival. So if your sun was not in the 8th house, or there was a harsh aspect to your sun sign, or your rulers, Mars and Pluto, were in harsh aspect to each other, it could bring out a great weakness in you. And one of the weaknesses would be that you could turn jealous, or you'd be extremely possessive, or else you could turn into somebody who was very revengeful and cruel. And so you'd want to watch out for that as well. Okay, what does it mean to a Sagittarius? Well, Sagittarius, your sign rules the traditional 9th house of the higher mind, long distance travel, international dealings, and it has a lot to do with judgment because it also rules religion and philosophy and four-year colleges and universities or institutions of higher learning. So it's an intellectual sign. And so if your sun is not in the 9th house, or if there is a harsh aspect to your ruler, Jupiter, it could simply mean that you could not be quite so high-minded. And it also means that you could be so restless that you actually wouldn't go to college because you'd think you know everything already, and you could be very impatient. For instance, if Mars is in Sagittarius anywhere in the chart, that is the sign of somebody who would either have to work very hard at college or wouldn't go at all because they would be so impatient they couldn't sit through a regular four-year educational program. And so that could create a weakness because you too could become a rolling stone. You could incessantly travel or start and stop a lot of different things and never reach the high goals that you set for yourself. So you have to watch out for that. Okay, what does it mean to a Capricorn? Well, Capricorn, your sign rules that traditional 10th house of career. And so respect is very important to you. And you like to be in the public eye, or you like to be serving on committees. You like to be doing things in a thorough manner where you don't skip steps at all because your sign rules perseverance. It also, the ruler is Saturn for your sun sign, and so it rules rewards that are earned over a long period of time, the hard way, and it also rules pension plans. So you are a person who is very security prone. However, if Saturn is in Capricorn, it could make you extremely frugal and even limit your own emotional output, and you would be much more concerned with the bottom line or pinching pennies than in having satisfying or romantic relationships. So that could be a weakness. You'd live a very long time, but you may not live happily. And so it would be good if there would be a good aspect with Venus in your chart, because that could bring you love and romance as well. But generally a Capricorn is very insecure and a little bit, they sort of look before they leap, or they would marry for security. And so if you don't have those opportunities, then you would end up living alone for a very long time. So loneliness could be a weakness of yours, and you need to watch out for that. Okay, what does it mean to an Aquarian? Well, Aquarius, your sign rules that traditional 11th house of hopes and wishes and people higher on the social scale than you are, and it rules sudden change, and it rules eccentricities and inventions. And so Aquarians sort of dance to their own drummer. Since it does rule music, it simply means that whatever your thoughts are or wherever they're leading you, it's perfectly okay with you. You're happy. But you are not easily understood by other people, particularly if Mercury is harshly aspected in your chart. You would not be too good at explaining things to other people. And also, if Mars or Saturn or even Uranus, your own sun sign ruler, was harshly aspecting your sun, it could make you too eccentric, too rebellious, and you would not be able to ever make any of your dreams actually come true. And it also means that you could be the kind of person who would not, your sign does rule being a humanitarian, but you could turn a blind eye to humanitarian needs if there were very harsh or limiting aspects in your chart, or if your sun was not in the 11th house, but instead it was in another house, that would mean that you would be more concerned with other interests instead of following your own special star, which is what you actually really like to do. So that could be a weakness, and it could be because you could be confused, distracted, or simply turn against people very suddenly, and that could cause a lot of alienation, which would be a little sad. So you need to watch out for that. Okay, what does it mean to a Pisces? Well, Pisces, your sign rules the traditional 12th house of hidden enemies and all areas of confinement, such as jails or hospitals or concentration camps. But your sign also rules synthesis and dreams and creativity and the ability to see something good even in a terrible situation. And so your sign also rules charity and forgiveness, but it rules escape as well. And so it can be escape through alcoholism, drug addiction, or any kind of denial or kidding yourself about things. So you have to really watch out for that. It's sort of a slippery slope if you have your sun in some other house, or if there is a harsh aspect between your sun and your moon and your ascendant, or if Neptune, the ruler of your sign, is harshly aspected in your chart. It means that you could even be daunted by unseen fears that frighten you a little bit, and that could stop you from reaching your full goals or making your dreams come true. So that could be a weakness. So what we've discussed is a general way of looking at the chart, but we're also thinking about the strengths and weaknesses by sign and by house. So I hope this has given you something to think about. Thanks a lot. I'll see you next week on STARBORN. Bye.